the Market Musings podcast, where today we welcome Richard Conroy, the chairman of Conroy Gold, an Ireland-based gold exploration company with an ambition to mine a big gold deposit found in the County Monaghan region of Ireland. Hi, Richard. It's really great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Kenny. How are you?
I'm very well. And Kenny, I'm Mark. How is Kenny?
You're Mark.
Yeah.
Okay. We have to redo that part then.
It's fine. No, it's fine.
We'll just keep it in. That's the beauty of these podcasts, Richard. It's just
natural.
let it roll.
Yeah,
it's natural. So no, it's good. It's good to have you on, Richard. I've spoke to you a few times in the past, and we were just discussing the weather before we went on here. And you said that the weather was horrific in Ireland, and it was horrific, and still is a bit horrific here. But the sun's coming over, you said, so I'm looking forward to some decent weather.
Good.
I believe,
Good.
Mark, you've got decent weather in Holland.
Yes, I've got very, very decent weather. Yes, it's very warm, 27 degrees, blue skies. Day to be outside, or maybe not. Maybe it's too hot, but yeah, it's lovely over here.
Well, it's marvelous for this time of year, September to have.
I know.
That's marvelous. That's terrific. Let's
Four
hope
seasons.
it stays on for a while, because the summer wasn't much to talk about.
Definitely.
No, it's very true. Yes, it's very true.
But there we go, Richard. So, yeah, myself and Mark have done a lot of these podcasts over the last several months, and what we like to do when we get directors of these companies on is we like to find out about the person as well as the business. So, if it's all right with you, we'd like to sort of dig into your past, and you can go back as far as you want, where you're born, what your childhood was like, early education, and then university, how you get into geology, etc. So it's really an open forum for you to tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I hope in the process you don't go off to sleep or absolutely bored stiff, but I'll try.
I'm sure.
As it happens, I was born in England, born in Birmingham, of Irish parents. My father was in the university there, but at a very early stage, we moved back over, one could say, to Ireland. My father had been appointed as a professor in Trinity College in Dublin, but unfortunately, he died before he could take up the position, and we continued living on in Dublin. I went to the local school, fairly well-known school in Israel, particularly in terms of rugby, and that was Blackrock College, which quite a few rugby players down through the ages have played for Ireland. Now, I certainly wasn't anywhere up to near that standard, but nonetheless, it was, I must say, an enjoyable period of my life, living in Booterstown and going to Blackrock College, and generally, despite my father's death, other than that, a very pleasant period in life. In the meantime, my elder brother qualified in medicine. I had been thinking of law, but decided I would do medicine as well. And I was fortunate enough to get first place in the entry exam to the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, which gave me a very substantial reduction in fees. So I started off my medical course and continued it there in the college. Again, a very pleasant experience. It was unusual in those days in that there was a considerable international element. Over 40% of the students were from what used to be called the developing countries, and about another 20% from the so-called developed countries, Canada and Norway and so on. The rest of us were from Ireland. So it was, for those days, a very cosmopolitan, very interesting college to be in. A private institution as the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and has continued to be private, although it's now a university associated with the General National University Group in Ireland. And from there, from medical school, worked in hospitals and as a doctor in practice, and then decided I'd do a postgraduate degree in physiology. I'd been a student demonstrator in physiology, and I thought, well, I'd like to do a bit more of it, and was fortunate enough to be accepted as a postgraduate student in Manchester University and that began quite a long association and very pleasant association with Manchester. I first of all did an MSc there, and then I got an invitation to come back to Dublin as a registrar in my teaching hospital. I came back to that, did it, and then was invited back to Manchester to join the staff of the physiology department. And stayed there for a number of years, and was fortunate enough in that time to do quite a bit of research that I very much enjoyed. Research on brain mechanisms and transmission between nerve cells, and then ultimately work on what are called circadian rhythms, the 24-hour rhythms. And John Mills and I did a lot of the early work there, and ended up writing the first textbook on human circadian rhythms. Fascinating subject, which involved everything from the normal sort of laboratory work that one does to be done in the Cheddar Caves, with a chap there who was breaking the record for staying underground in isolation. But at the same time, that gave John Mills and myself the chance to study his physiology while in isolation. We demonstrated there that the normal human day keeps moving around the clock. You tend normally to wake up that little bit later, go to sleep that little bit later, so that it's hence the term circadian, around about a day. And there's all sorts of implications in studying brain mechanisms, abstruse brain mechanisms, but also very practical applications in how long do you organize shifts for? How long do you organize night shifts for? If you're running an industry, you know well that more accidents tend to occur at 4 o'clock in the morning. Why is that? What can you do about it? Should people be on permanent night shift, or should there be a much more rapidly rotating shift? So there are all sorts of very practical implications. And indeed, one of the very other interesting experiments that we did was in night shift workers in the newspaper industry. In those times, it was still the traditional printing presses, and they worked during the night time for the papers to be ready in the morning. So they were among the few groups of people who were genuinely night workers. Lots of people describe themselves as night workers and do a lot of work at night, but there are very few who enter an industry, as people did in those days, at perhaps the age of 14 or 15 years, and then stay in it for the rest of their lives. And they don't have any day work. It's virtually all night work, week in, week out. So they become very much adapted to that form of existence in their social life and in their physiology. So it's a very interesting practical aspect of circadian rhythms. The other very interesting one, on which indeed I wrote a few papers, business applications of time zone transitions. What's the difference for a businessman flying out, shall we say, to North America, to Canada, the United States, and doing business there, as opposed to flying down to, shall we say, South Africa? Very important for an airline pilot. There's all the difference in the world between spending several hours flying out to the States and coming back, changing your time zones. Whereas if you fly down to Johannesburg or Cape Town, there's virtually no change in your time zone. So the number of hours flying may be very similar, but the effects on your physiology, as people experience and know, are much greater. Same applies in business. And when we were doing our survey of business people, I personally met with many of the leading business people, both in the United Kingdom and in North America at the time. And a sort of simple, basic question was, well, would you do business at 4 o'clock in the morning? Of course I wouldn't. But they're perfectly capable of perhaps flying out somewhere and in effect the following day or 2 days later doing business at 4 o'clock in the morning. May not matter at a certain level, but at a very top level, one came across one or two decisions which, on reflection, people might perhaps have approached differently. So it was a very interesting period in my existence. Now, as I think I mentioned a bit earlier, I hope I'm not boring you too much.
No, absolutely. The circadian rhythms is actually very interesting. And is it something that I'm trying to understand a little bit how it sort of works? Because sometimes can it get a little bit out of out of whack or out of sync? And is there sort of some things you can perhaps do in your life to try and resync it? I mean, someone once told me that the moon, and this may be getting a bit I don't know, a bit weird, but the moon sort of speaks to your circadian rhythm, and looking at the moon is very healthy for you. I don't know if that's true, but I think that it's a fascinating subject, and yeah, do you do anything in your life, Richard, to to sort of keep it in sync, or make the most of it?
It's a very deeply, you're quite right, it's a very deeply embedded mechanism, and it does have all sorts of implications. People are still working at what they call the Zeitgeber, the time givers. Why is it and how is it that we have these? But if you're born in the UK or Ireland, by the time you're about 4 or 5 years old, these rhythms are very deeply embedded in you. Some you're perhaps aware of, your sleep-wake cycle, the fact of the appetite that you have at a certain time of day, these sort of things, some very obvious things. But many others are also very deeply embedded, things that you're totally unaware of. Your endocrine changes over the 24 hours or slightly more than the 24 hours, you're totally unaware of them. We had one subject who went out from Manchester to Chicago and was kind enough to keep an exact record of changes such as those in temperature. And you could see there, and about morning people and evening people, which is another fascinating aspect of circadian rhythms. But and each of us has a virtually unique temperature pattern over the approximately 24 hours. She anyway went out to Chicago, took records, and after a few days, her time for eating and so on, sleeping and waking was, as far as she was concerned, coming back pretty well to normal. She was taking records of her temperature, and it was back sort of a normal rhythm after a couple of weeks. But there were other aspects of things that she was testing, or at least providing samples for, such as in her blood. And in actual fact, even though she spent 3 months out in Canada and Toronto, and then came back to Manchester, she was still showing changes in the endocrine levels in her blood, almost as though she had never left Manchester and gone out to Canada. So they're very deep-seated indeed. And there are some things that you can do, some medicines you can give, which can have an effect on them, but they are a quite genuine problem, obviously for airline pilots in the first instance, but they do have some significance in business terms as well. For most people, it's just a little bit of a nuisance of anything, or an amusement even. But some of the implications are quite important. And as you were rightly saying at the beginning, just how are they controlled? Why is it that we have this rhythm of approximately 24 hours? What are the various factors, and what is the significance? There's a certain amount of medical significance. There are some drugs, for example, which are better given late in the evening and so on like that. But there's a huge amount. We were fortunate enough to be in the very early days of it and write the first textbook on human circadian rhythms. But nonetheless, we're really only at the beginning of understanding it. So it's a fascinating subject.
It is a fascinating subject.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating, it's very complicated as well. But I think it is worth exploring it a little bit, because you can certainly, I think, make the most of it. And what I mean by that is, I think around about 10 o'clock in the morning is your sort of peak, I believe, in your alertness. And so it's a good time to be sort of focusing on work, for example. And then in the evening around sort of 5 or 6, you've got the greatest cardiovascular and muscle strength. So perhaps a good time to, go on a run or do your daily exercise at that time. And that's what I sort of was meaning when you can use the circadian rhythm to really just sync it with your life to get peak performance, really. And the same applies in business.
Well, you're absolutely right, and one can even take it a little bit further. That you're almost certainly describing yourself. and the most frequent pattern is that you have described. But in actual fact, there are people who are much more alert, shall we say, at 10 o'clock at night or 7 o'clock in the evening, and would be far better off taking their 5-mile run or whatever at 10 o'clock in the morning. So there's a great deal of individual variation, and you can even see that in that you've probably had your temperature taken, particularly in these COVID days, quite frequently. But temperatures actually vary over the 24 hours, and they vary in general terms. If you were to take 50 people, you'd get an average of peaks and lows over that 24-hour period. But if you were to look at each individual, you'd find that some people have relatively early peaks in their temperature, some people relatively late, some people not all that much change during the course of the 24 hours. And what's fascinating in many ways is that for each individual, it tends to follow a constant pattern. Your temperature rhythm over the 24 hours today will be replicated in 3 weeks' time if we were to take your temperature again over the 24 hours. If your good colleague, if we were to take his temperature today, we'd be able to see some differences probably in the pattern from yours, and those differences would still persist in a few weeks' time if we repeated the experiment or the process. So it's really all sorts of aspects to it which are fascinating. But one of the other things which it did for me, as it were, if that's the correct word, there is that, as I say, my father died when I was 6 years old. So money wasn't always very readily available. So certainly when I was a student, nowadays everyone works, but not quite so many did in those days. And one certainly became very much aware of financial, shall we say, aspects, even at that level. And indeed, when I went to Manchester, in those days, you didn't have these various scholarships, which thank goodness one does have today. And so I used to work and practice as a doctor at weekends, doing locums and so on. And then my brother, whom, as I've mentioned, is also a doctor, we thought, well, there are a lot of doctors in those days, general practitioners, and they're working every evening and every weekend. Maybe they might be in a group practice, in which case they could balance it out a bit. But by and large, that's the way the system was. And we thought of what at the time was a novel idea of putting together a deputizing service so that we offered to work for these doctors from 7 o'clock in the evening till 8 o'clock in the morning and at weekends. It's now become very familiar. Out-of-hour services are all over the country, probably all over the world. But at that time, it was a novel idea. And it became quite a big business. We ended up covering the entire Greater Manchester area, over 3 million people. I, as it so happened, with my physiological interests and so on, ended up coming back to Dublin as professor in the Royal College of Surgeons there of physiology. But my brother continued it on, and it became quite a significant business, and was imitated or emulated, perhaps, pretty well everywhere. It's now a normal part of medical practice. In the evenings, you'll have the out-of-hours doctor comes. But when we set it up, and we set it up as a business, which is another interesting aspect, I have enormous, admiration and obviously knowledge of my good medical colleagues who do terrific work, and we've seen this in the coronavirus situation and all the rest of it, and all the many other people who did so much work in that respect. But for my medical colleagues, but one of the aspects which perhaps, and I noticed it because remember I had to sort of make my way as I went along and earn a living and so on in a sort of a rather different context, is that although they could be excellent surgeons, physicians, general practitioners, and so on, that was what they were interested in. That was what their life was, and they did it and do it extraordinarily well. But they're not business people. They're not looking at it Whereas when my brother and I set up this deputizing service, it was from a business point of view. One wanted to find another way of earning an income. And although it may seem very obvious now, when we set it up, it was quite novel. And indeed, my brother sold it many years later for for a few million, I think, the business, because it then became very, very, very large indeed. And I equate this to some extent with the mining business. Sometimes people ask me, well, you're a doctor. How on earth are you in natural resources? How on earth are you in mining? And
yes, it's a far cry.
It seems
that was my next question.
A far cry. But curiously enough, from having been involved from an early age in having to look at money from a business point of view, and from building up a business which became a significant medical business, which has now been, as I say, imitated elsewhere, certainly throughout these islands and many other parts of the world as well. One looked at things from a slightly different aspect. And the same, I think, applies in mining. I'm a medical person. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a mining engineer. And I have the greatest admiration for these people who are in mining, and they're dedicated to it. Fantastic geologists, fantastic mining engineers, fantastic geophysicists, and so on. But they're not necessarily business people. And if there's one thing I see in the mining industry is how few mining people, yes, they're very much aware of the bottom line and you have to make a profit and so on, but nonetheless, they're really coming from their line of professional excellence, which is geology or is constructing a mine or processing or whatever it may be. And in some ways, it reminds me very much of the medical profession, where you have these absolutely dedicated, superb people, but they're not business people. And so in my involvement in the natural resources industry, I'm looking at it with the greatest respect, because they're absolutely essential. There's no way you build a good mine without having the right people doing it. And in my medical sense, I had the privilege of being the chairman of the board which built Ireland's largest medical complex, the Tala, which we brought 3 teaching hospitals together and built a new hospital. But we did it again from a business sense. And it was one of the few government-sponsored in which we actually came in slightly under budget, which is unusual for all sorts of understandable reasons in government-sponsored projects. But it's a different way of looking at things. I'm not saying that you don't have to have luck as well, and I've had tremendous good luck in been involved in finding the Galmoy ore bodies and the Pogo gold deposit and now the deposits and the gold trend in Ireland and so on. You certainly have to have luck. But at the same time, you're looking at it from a different aspect, I think. And the one person whom I greatly admire in this respect in the mining industry is Ray Bristow. And indeed, this is an aspect which he has exemplified of bringing the business aspect to mining. You must have very high mining standards, but you must also be thinking of it. It is a business. That's what it's all about. And he has done this fantastic job, first of all in Ranfontaine, and now, of course, in Barrack. And in a very tiny way, a very, very small way, when we look at things in my own business, that's the way we try to look at it as well. You're there not to look for some very interesting geological thing. You're there to look for something which could be an economic deposit which pays for the risk that you've taken in exploring for it. And to always have that in front of my own eyes, of my immediate colleagues, and of all our technical people who are such excellent people working with us. But that's the object of the exercise. And I think it's tremendously important and very understandably, not always perhaps as much at the forefront as perhaps it might otherwise be, because of the very demanding professional skills that are required in geology and mining, just as they are in medicine as well. And you have to have the right people to do and carry out these functions. But at the same time, you have to, if you're running a business, look at it from a business point of view. So in that strange sort of way, but it's not so strange when you think about it, I find it very interesting, having been in the business side of medicine, to be in the business side of mining. Now, my first introduction was inevitably almost chance. Mentioned that I was a professor in the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and it's very international. It's also particularly international in that not only in Great Britain and Ireland, but in many parts of the world. If you want to specialize in surgery, you'll take a fellowship in Edinburgh or Glasgow or London or Dublin. So the respective colleges have a very large number of postgraduate people who are specializing in surgery, coming to take their examinations, coming to study in these islands. And equally well, they will run or do run courses, examinations, and indeed the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland runs 2 medical schools, one in Bahrain and the other out in Malaysia. But one was very much involved as the professor of physiology. It was one of the key subjects, as it so happened, in relation to postgraduate physiology, anatomy, and surgery, and so on. And so one had many connections out in the Gulf states. And when the oil crisis came about, I found myself through various these connections and various other connections which I had in Dublin, leading a delegation from Ireland out to the Gulf states, and eventually becoming involved in making arrangements for petroleum product for Ireland. We had still only have one small refinery. During the oil crisis, we were totally dependent on the United Kingdom. And I must say the United Kingdom was extremely good in granting support to Ireland and ensuring that we had supplies of petroleum. But at the same time, we had to start looking around ourselves and seeing what we could do. And I was very much involved in that process, and subsequently set up, having become involved, found it fascinating, subsequently set up a consortium to explore in Irish offshore waters. This was one of the largest consortium we've had in Irish offshore waters. It included Deminex from Germany and the Austrian State Company and the Dutch, and also Mobil from the United States, which is now, of course, moved on from that. And indeed, we discovered some of the first oil shows in the Celtic Basin in southwest of Ireland. Later on, we were involved with British Petroleum through a company called Arran Energy in exploration in the Atlantic. Very large structures out there, which probably contain quite amounts of oil, but are very deep. So thus I became involved in natural resources. And curiously enough, almost as a side aspect of that, became involved in hard rock. And they're very, very different. And not many oil companies succeed when they go into the hard rock business. I can think of many of the major companies went into hard rock and then came right back out again, understandably so. The one exception, I think, is BHP, which started in hard rock and then expanded out into the petroleum world. They're very different. But as it so happened, we had in Ireland one or two interesting discoveries of zinc, a mine at Tina, west of Ireland, and then later a very large deposit, the Tara or Navan deposit, which is, as a mine, still going strong. It's, I think, certainly one of the largest, not the largest in Europe, and in the top 10 worldwide. And while running the exploration oil company, my brother and I, he was one of the directors, said, why is it that there's more exploration for zinc in Ireland? And we thought, well, let's raise a bit of money for zinc exploration and do some. Seemed reasonable. But the answer we got was, as it happened, I was still a professor in the College of Surgeons. And I was told, well, Professor, you may know not something about offshore oil exploration. I'm not sure that I did. But anyway, that was said. But onshore exploration is very different. And I absolutely agree with that. Onshore exploration for hard rock. And in any event, all the majors have been in here. And if there was anything to be found, they'd have found it. And to some extent, I thought, well, that's not necessarily an argument against something, however reasonable it may sound. And I thought, well, the Tara ore body, this one of the largest, as I said, in the world, top 10, it actually literally came up to the surface. Indeed, my brother and I used to cycle up to the Cavan Fermanagh region when we were youngsters, and we knew we were halfway there because the color of the tar changed from a darkish color to a pinkish color. And that pinkish color was actually due to, that was before the discovery of the mine, due to the different substance which was being unwittingly used by the county council for tarring the roads at that time. So there's trivial but amusing things which sometimes, if you think about them, can actually come to mean something. But anyway, it so happened also that when I was had the privilege of working in the physiology department in Manchester University, one of the adjacent departments was the Rutherford department. Absolutely fantastic people working there. I was privileged to be working with the excellent people I was working with in physiology. But you had equally good or even better people working in it was and still is one of the leading geophysics departments in the world, as indeed the physiology department in Manchester is also a very leading department in that world. But anyway, not that I knew anything about geophysics at the time, but the thought struck me, how much do they use geophysics in geology? Because in geophysics, you get changes in magnetics, you get changes in polarization and so on. And in actual fact, it was beginning to be used quite a bit. And I thought inquired with one or two technical colleagues, and they did a trace on the Navan ore body and could show it up very well by means of geophysics. So what we did was we looked at the work that the majors had done and the geochemical anomalies that they discovered, but we also did geophysics around these anomalies. Now, I say this in the sense that although we had been able to raise money for offshore oil exploration, and believe you me, if you really want to have put money in and big risk money in, do offshore oil exploration. But we couldn't raise any money for doing onshore zinc exploration. And my brother and I actually, between us, put up 60,000 into the company in order to allow us to carry out a program of zinc exploration. And using geophysics and accompanied by geochemistry, we ended up discovering the Galmoy ore bodies, zinc ore bodies, which subsequently were developed as a major mine, led to the Lisheen discovery down the road from us. And when we were at the peak of production between Tara, our mine at Galmoy, and the Lisheen mine, Ivernia Anglo-American, and later Vedanta, between the three mines, we were producing nearly 33% of the entire Western European demand for zinc. Zinc, as I'm sure you know, is largely used in the car industry, the automobile industry. And I would say pretty well every significant zinc company in the world is now out there exploring for zinc in Ireland. However, in the meantime, one had been rung up one day by a very nice guy, Jack McEwen, of a consultancy firm out in Canada, who'd done quite a bit of work with us at Galmoy. And he said, Richard, would you be interested in a gold prospect in Alaska? And I said, Jack, a gold prospect in Alaska? And we're up to our tonsils here in Ireland. He said, no, this could be very interesting. Anyway, one went out to talk with him, and they had been employed at WGM, Watts Griffiths & Crotch, an excellent consultancy company, still going strong, I think mainly in Saudi Arabia now, but anyway. They had been employed by Exxon in Alaska, and they had taken out a very considerable acreage, but it was new acreage. There weren't many other people looking there. But I knew the geologists concerned, and there were jolly good geologists that had been concerned in the Red Dog discovery, the north of Alaska, an excellent zinc discovery, and that advised and worked with us in Galmoy. I thought, these are good chaps who know what they're doing. However, Exxon, as I mentioned, many of the big oil companies came into minerals and then decided it wasn't for them and went again. So Exxon, anyway, gave up the property, so it fell to WGM, the consultancy group, and they had tried to get anyone they could in Canada, which tends to regard with some justice itself as the leading mining area in the world, or in the United States, and Alaska obviously is part of the US of A. Well, they couldn't get anyone in. So anyway, he rang me up in Ireland, and we went out and talked. And I thought, this has prospects. It's new. It hasn't been looked at properly. And again, with my technical college, getting their advice and input, and that of the chaps from WGM. And quite honestly, I thought that we'd be able to get somebody from Canada or the US to come in as partners. We had one group, Hemlo Gold, one of those people later joined our board, Michael Parr, as director. They had the initiative to at least look at it and to some extent come in. I didn't fully come in, but they were the only North American group to show serious interest. And we ended up bringing in a Japanese group, Sumitomo, and with them explored and came out with the discovery of Pogo, world-class gold discovery, still in production as a major gold mine. And of course, now you have every company that you can mention in North America and elsewhere. They're basically looking at that general area of Alaska. But it is yet another, as it were, lesson to me, in that particularly with large companies, they tend to move in groups. I suppose it's part of the human thing that if you're one of a group that makes a mistake, it doesn't matter. Whereas if you take an initiative and it doesn't work out, you're there in your own sort of thing. So perhaps that's a natural way. But if you are a small group, as we are, we're a tiny group in each of our existences, then you have to bring something new to the table. You must look at things in a slightly different direction, not too different. You're not in research. You're there as a business entity to make a profit. You're calculating, these are the risks. I have to make a very serious discovery to compensate for the money that's been spent and the risks against discovering an economic deposit. But I think it's an everyday experience that you would understand that if you look at things from a slightly different angle, they can look very different. I saw that in a perhaps traditional way. I was out in South Africa, and I was taken by this chap on a very few-hour foot safari, and I was terrified of my life, thinking a lion or something would come around the next corner or whatever. And the chap said to me, it's not lions or elephants you need to be afraid of, it's walking on a snake. It's much more likely to do you damage. But then he asked me, he said, you see that tree over there? And it was about, I'd say 100, 120 yards away, a bit longer perhaps. And he said, what do you see? And I obviously said, I see the tree. And he said, yes, you see the tree, but what do you see parts of the tree? And I looked very hard. And I still couldn't see anything that seemed very, very different to me. And then the animal was a kudu. It waved its tail, and it suddenly became obvious. And I thought, you can be looking at something and not see something, and yet it's there in front of your eyes. So you must look at it just that little bit differently, see something from a different angle, or some little movement, something catches your attention, and suddenly a very different picture appears. And I think that was with us in our zinc discoveries in Ireland. We used geophysics instead of the emphasis, as it was at the time, on geochemistry. Combine the two together. Nothing very clever about it, but it ended up in a major discovery which transformed the base metal industry in Ireland. Equally well, we looked at things a little bit differently in the area, which ended up with the Pogo gold discovery. And again, coming back now to Ireland, Ireland has, if you went to the National Museum, there you'll see these magnificent gold ornaments, and they truly are magnificent. Some of the best in Western Europe. But they're, 3,000, 4,000 years old. They're really, they go way back in history. And the academic theory at the time, with some people at any rate, was that the gold was imported into Ireland. And I must say, some of these ornaments were in our history books and geography books when I was a child. And I must say that seemed a bit strange that someone 4,000 years ago would row over in a boat to Ireland carrying gold for us to make it up into ornaments. Hard enough these days to run an import-export business internationally. But anyway, the other, perhaps more soundly based theory was that it came from alluvial gold, and that is a possibility. Some alluvial gold has been found in Ireland. There was indeed a gold rush in Wicklow back in the early 1800s. But nonetheless, there's not a great deal of alluvial gold in Ireland. And one just wondered, it didn't really seem to add up. And we looked at it. But I knew, as it so happened, as a youngster, that down an old antimony mine in County Monaghan, gold had been seen, created a certain amount of excitement at the time. But the follow-up drilling around it, when we looked into the old records, hadn't yielded anything very much. And people had gone away and more or less forgotten about it. But I thought, well, let's give this another look. So we got out all the old records that we could find and pored over them. And there was no doubt about it. These were some very good Canadian chaps who had dewatered the old antimony mine. The last time it had been dewatered had been back in the end of the First World War. Antimony is used for many purposes, but one of them is to make shrapnel even more unpleasant than it already is. And during the First World War, you apparently had these enormous artillery barrages, and they were running short of antimony, and so they were looking for it in everywhere they could find. And this old antimony mine in Ireland was reopened, as it so happened. The armistice, thank goodness, took place, and it never went into production, but it was found to be in good shape. So these Canadian geologists, 50 years later, went back down, reopened, dewatered the mine, and tested it not only for antimony, but for gold, and got quite excited. They were getting very good grades in the channel samples. And they then started a drilling program around the mine. But to their great disappointment, they were still getting, as we saw when we checked the old records, gold in every hole that they drilled, but at very low grades. Other companies came in and also drilled the same sort of result. And we sat and looked at these things, and we spent about 18 months just looking at these records and thinking about them and wondering. And it just didn't add up. How could you have such good gold grades down the old antimony mine, and yet when you drilled around it, you weren't able to repeat them, and yet you were seeing gold in the drilling you were doing, but only in very small quantities? And part of the reason may in fact have been because of the emphasis in Ireland, in which we'd participated, on zinc. In zinc, you're looking at 10, 15, maybe 20% zinc. You can take out a piece of core and look at it and literally see the zinc. And indeed, some of the core we got from Galmoy was as high as 25%, even higher in one or two special samples. But in gold, you're not looking at those percentages. You're looking at tiny amounts. If you're lucky, you can see the gold, But a lot of gold is not visible in the core. It's dissolved into the rock. And so when you looked at the core from Clontarf, you couldn't see any gold. You couldn't see it in the back channel samples either, even though they had quite high grades of gold. And you certainly couldn't see it in the drill samples with the very low grades. So we looked at this and wondered and wondered. And then coming back to the zinc, in zinc, it's perfectly acceptable to do double-barreled drilling because you're looking at high percentages that you can readily see in the core. In gold, it's a totally different situation in terms of visualization. But there's another aspect to it, and that is that the gold can be not in the nice solid rock that you'll see with zinc and lead or whatever in it, but in the friable rock. And if you use double-barrel drilling on that, what you can often do is just wash away the very rock that you want to see. You wash away the more friable aspects. And so if we decided then is that we would do triple-barrel drilling, it's a bit more expensive to do. But on the other hand, you don't, when you use triple barreling, you don't wash away the friable rock. And then to add to that, we also, when drilling, added a certain amount of resin in order to maintain the integrity insofar as one could. And as soon as we started to do that, we began to see nice grades of gold comparable to those down the mine and the old back channel samples that had been taken many, many years before. And it all seems very obvious, but believe you me, it took us 18 months to even think of what the solution might be, never mind to actually carry it out. And it seems so obvious, and you look at it now, yeah, things often are underneath your eyes and you don't see them.
You don't see them. Yeah.
However, as I mentioned a little earlier on, and I must stop now soon before you've all gone off to sleep, but we look on mining, our aspect is it's business. We need the highest possible technical input. The absolute excellent is essential, but nonetheless, that's not their responsibility. Their responsibility is the geology. Their responsibility is the mining processing. Their responsibility is the geophysics. It is not the business responsibility. That's ours, to work with them to ensure, insofar as you can, to ensure success. So when we looked at the Clontarf deposit, we were looking at it, weighing it up, wondering why could this happen and so on, needed all the technical input and common sense and all the rest of it to do that. But nonetheless, we were coming from the point is, could this make an economic deposit which would cover all the costs and risks that you're involved in? And we could see that the likelihood was, and I think that's been justified since, that it would. However, that was not sufficient. We didn't go into this. We've been involved in world-class discoveries at Pogo, world-class discoveries at, down in Galmoy, and this is what we were spending. If we're going to spend several years, and it's taken us many years, you're going to spend that sort of time. You want to have something not just interesting or a nice little discovery. You want, if you're lucky, to have something really worthwhile out of it. So we didn't just stop at Clontarf once we had ascertained that in actual fact you could get good gold grades in the drilling around the old antimony mine. We instead stood back and thought, could this possibly be not just an isolated deposit, happens to be associated with antimony, and that does happen sometimes, but could it be part of a trend? Sounds very simple to look at it, but in actual fact, we then spent several years taking soil sampling, our geologists working fantastically hard, and our technical people and all the rest of them. And it took a long time. On the other hand, nobody else was interested at the time. The early stages, Mr. Brown sold off a lot of gold, which hurt the entire gold industry. The smaller companies couldn't raise money to do gold exploration. The larger companies are really moving away from actual grassroots exploration. they may have exploration departments, but very often when you talk with the chaps concerned, you realize that they're really assessment departments assessing what discoveries made by people such as ourselves, rather than actually going out in the field looking for new discoveries, or they're in established areas or whatever. So when we started to do our work, and we began to get results, it took a long time, but we were able, since the exploration system in Ireland is a work commitment, you must put money into the ground. It's a very good system in many ways, because if you do put that money into the ground, it's going into the exploration. And secondly, it enables you to retain your license, and you're not paying rentals or things like that that are just going nowhere, as it were, neither to the company's benefit nor, other than to a minor extent, to the government's benefit. Whereas when you're putting money into the ground, if you're successful, of course, it's going to be beneficial both to the company and to the government and to the local population and so on. And that enabled us, as our exploration proceeded, to build up our exploration acreage, sometimes taking acreage and then dropping it when we felt, not worthwhile keeping on. But we steadily built up, and we're fortunate enough. We thought there might be a trend. We certainly didn't expect it to be 40 miles in length, with a whole series of potential other deposits in it, quite apart from Clontibret. But we were very lucky, you could say, in that, but we also worked very, very hard at it. Had a lot of skepticism, I can tell you, at times. People wondered what on earth we were doing and so on. But now we're in a situation in which we've recently had a booth out at the main mining conference in Toronto, PDAC as it's called. First of all, we were getting very little attention there. We talked about zinc that have come to us, but gold, Ireland, no. People just shook their heads, didn't even think of it in terms of gold.
Yeah.
We gradually got over the idea that there is gold in Ireland, and our colleagues in Dalradian have also shown very substantial gold in their deposit a bit further north of ours. And people began to realize, yes, there's significant potential for gold in Ireland. And at this recent PDAC in March, our chaps, we opened the booth at 10:30 on Sunday morning and kept working right through till 11:30 on Wednesday. And the chaps were kept busy the entire time. I'm pleased to say the Irish Minister for Mining also came over and visited our stand. They're very positive about mining, and obviously high environmental standards, but very positive that mining should go ahead. And that's right. And indeed, Galmoy, Tara, and Lachine are now quoted in the textbooks as examples of modern day mining in which the environmental standards are high, and yet they're very profitable mines. And that's what we hope to do at Clontibret and elsewhere along Ferdown Massif, as the area is called. But we got intense interest from 9:30 in the morning on Sunday right through to the Wednesday. The guys hardly had time to get a cup of coffee, as one chap said.
That's good. It's good that it's great that perhaps awareness is becoming more, because I think you're right. People don't really perhaps believe that there's sort of gold in Ireland, but it's great that you're getting that traction. And you recently got involved in a joint venture, is that right? So again,
yes, that's correct. Well, at the last PDAC meeting, not only had people very interested and constantly coming over to us, but as well as that, many of them arranged to do site visits. And then we came back from PDAC, and almost immediately you had the COVID situation. International flights were closed down. One chap was due to do a site visit with us on 1st of May. I think he's somewhere still out in Central Asia. I'm not sure if he's got back yet. It all came very, very suddenly. But nonetheless, some of the companies, including Anglo-Asian, which is the one with whom we signed heads of terms, had already made site visits before before the closure, they had coming from one of our previous PDECs or other contacts, made site visits. So in actual fact, we're fortunate in that sense, and the Anglo-Asian people have made a number of visits to us, and they came up with very interesting heads of terms to us, which we have been pleased to sign. So we still have to sign off, obviously, on the final agreement, but we're working on that. It all takes time, and particularly in these COVID days when there's so little movement, you can't just fly over to London and meet somebody, or somebody fly over from Azerbaijan, which is where Anglo-Asian are based. It all takes, but it always takes a lot of time once you start to go into the legal details and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, we're making progress, and we feel that, which is why we looked for a joint venture partner, and we didn't look previously for joint venture partners. We said, get on with the exploration. That was our job to do, and we did it. However, this is so large now. You're looking at this 40-mile, 65-kilometer trend. It's going to require a tremendous amount of further work, drilling work, far beyond the sort of resources that we have or could reasonably raise without diluting ourselves out of existence. So it's time for us to look for a joint venture partner. And the arrangement that we have with the Anglo-Asian, of course, it's not just a question of bringing in the first mine at Clontibret. That's obviously a key part of it, and there's nothing like getting a mine going and gold pouring for people to really take it on board, the reality of it.
Of course.
But also the agreement is that there will be support for the exploration in the other areas, particularly the major areas such as Clay Lake, where you have a target, gold in bedrock demonstrated, proven, I should say, in which the actual footprint of the target is very considerably larger than Clontibret. It's to the northeast of Clontibret, to the southwest of Clontibret, another target, Glenish, again with a far larger footprint than the Clontibret target. And then there are a series of other targets as you follow the trend. So there's going to be work going on there, I'm sure, for many, many years to come, many other discoveries to be made, even within our own license area. But we feel now is the time to bring in the first mine, and that's what our primary objective will be. We're already obviously working on it, done quite a lot of the preliminary work already, but we also will be continuing with the exploration, because there are a series of other targets which could be, Clontibret itself could be quite large. We've already, as you know, 500,000 ounce resource, and that's only on a very small part of it, down to a very shallow level. The entire deposit is open on all sides. It's open to depth. So you're probably looking at 2 to 3 million ounces there when it's drilled out. But the other targets, Clay Lake, Glenish, could be considerably larger targets. Our own internal estimates, and these are JORC, but they're not JORC resource estimates. They're purely target estimates. But even going down to 200 meters, and even just only taking in Clontibret, Glenish, and Clay Lake, we are looking at a target of 8.8 million ounces in addition to the 500,000 ounces. So you're looking at, even by gold industry terms, targets which are quite substantial targets. So it's a very exciting time, and certainly we'll be looking ahead very much to. A lot of things have to be done, a lot further drilling to be done, a lot of extra work, hydrogeology and all that sort of thing. And we have to go through the planning process, the mining permitting process. Again, these have been streamlined in Ireland a lot from when we brought in Galmoig. Then you had to go through the planning process. You had to go through a whole series of environmental permissions. And then you had to turn around and start all over again looking for your mining permit. Now they have all been brought together so as you can do them in tandem. All the environmental permissions have been brought under one heading, and you can do those together with your planning application, but you can also be proceeding with your mining permit, so that although the legal situation is you must first get planning permission, it's not a situation any longer in which you got planning permission then started all over again. Instead, since you're able to twin track it, you can get your planning permission, or shall we say a Monday, and your mining permit on a Tuesday.
Right.
So it's been considerably streamlined. So we're looking forward to getting to that stage and then getting into construction.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like you're entering a significant phase. It must feel very good, as you said, exciting.
It's tremendous, very exciting and very satisfying as well. And okay, a lot of it has been luck, but it's nice when you have a bit of luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the look of the Irish, eh?
Yeah, I mean, you actually look at the joint venture or the potential joint venture. I mean, there's quite a hefty spend in the first 4 months for Anglo-Asian to get their 25%. So €4 million.
Yes, indeed. It's running into the drilling program. Will run into a several £1 million program.
Yeah.
It's a very different thing. 3 or 4 holes in exploration, you're getting the general outline of a deposit. But when you have to do your infill drilling and then start to spread out from that, the number of drill holes goes up exponentially, and obviously the cost goes up exponentially. As well as that, as I mentioned, we've only been down to deepest hole that we've drilled is just over 350 meters. We were still encountering gold lodes at 325 meters, and we've no reason to believe that they shouldn't go down for many hundred meters below that.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a whole new ball game when you start to put in deep holes. But it's very fascinating. We're particularly fascinated by the fact that although no two ore bodies are ever the same, nonetheless, there are some very interesting similarities to the Fosterville situation out in Australia, in the ore itself and in the processing that we'll be looking at. It'll probably be some form of BIOX or similar process, which has been used very successfully in Fosterville. And also you're seeing this sort of trend of what you're seeing at the surface, which seems to get greater as you go down deeper. Now, obviously, it's all proven in Fosterville, whereas it all lies ahead of us, but it's a very exciting situation.
Yeah. And will Anglo be the operators of this drill program, or is it?
No. The arrangement is that we bring it through to the stage of having a mining permit. And they'll obviously be tremendously involved and they'll be putting up the money for it and all that sort of thing. And obviously there'll be a tremendous amount of discussion and how we go about it and the drilling and all that sort of thing. But it's our responsibility to bring it through to the stage at which we've planning permission and mining permit. And then they obviously take over from the construction stage and the mine development and processing and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, so no, it definitely looks like a exciting time ahead for both companies. Yeah,
exciting. Really, even the planning of it is exciting.
Yeah, well, hopefully these guys get that signature on the bit of paper and get the news out to market, and then it feels real. So it does after. I know it is real, but from an investor point of view, they get that sort of warm feeling that the joint venture's going ahead. You know, the money.
Yeah, well, it's going ahead all right. In fact, there are 1 or 2 people. In fact, it's been rather nice, and that some of the people, as I say, who had wanted to come and visit us, and were even arranging site visits and so on, they've actually rung us up and wished us well, which is very nice from some of the largest companies in the world, and I think that's very nice.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, well, it's been a fascinating story. I had no idea, Richard, that you had started off. Well, I'd read your bio and I knew there was a medical background, but I didn't realise it had been so extensive and covering such a wide demographic as well. So no, it's been brilliant having you on, and it's always good to hear people's life stories, what they've done, because some of the journeys we've heard have just been tremendous, and how people have ended up in the natural resources sector.
A lot of people have done fantastic things, and thank you for listening so patiently. I'm sure occasionally you felt like stopping the flow, as it were.
No, not like it all flowed pretty well. So it did. We got into Conroy. I mean, that's obviously what we wanted to talk about in the end. And you've covered every aspect of it. Mark, is there anything else you want to touch on before?
No, it was a really, really interesting talking to you, Richard. Yeah, learning about your background, and maybe we should do a podcast focused on circadian rhythms at some point. I don't know. It might be interesting. But
I actually spent 4 years doing constant night shift, and I loved it. It was
right.
The sleep side of the night shift was great. I only needed like 4 or 5 hours, if that, every day off a night shift or every night. Yeah, for some reason I can get a better sleep off a night shift than I can.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
night.
yeah. No, it's fascinating once you begin to look into it and think of your own experiences and all the rest of it. Really.
Yeah, it was brilliant. So it was, but there we go. All right, I appreciate the time, Richard, and hopefully
thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank
we'll get you back on when you've when the ink's dry in that agreement, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Richard, for your time, and we'll speak to you soon.
Yep. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, then. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another podcast from Market Musings with Fairbairn and Russell.